My guest today is Dr. Dean Radin. Dean is a parapsychologist with a bachelor's and a master's degree in electrical engineering. He also holds his PhD in educational psychology. He has an impressive resume, having been part of various research teams like at Bell Labs, Princeton University, GTE Labs, University of Edinburgh, and SRI International. He currently serves as the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences and is a distinguished professor of integral and transpersonal psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He is the author of over 100 academic articles in peer-reviewed journals and has written several books. The latest one is called Real Magic. Dr. Radin, yours is a voice to be heard on the subject of consciousness. Welcome to the conversation.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So you've been at this business of parapsychology for quite some time, psi research. How did you first get involved in parapsychology?
I read a lot of science fiction and fairy tales. Mm-hmm. And as a child, I still read science fiction now. Mm-hmm. And it sparks the imagination. And anyone who's paying attention, they would naturally wonder, I wonder if these stories are more than simply stories, mm-hmm. that they're reflections of some aspect of reality that might exist, given that the stories are universal in culture and history, and more importantly, that people report experiences that seem similar to what shows up in these stories. Mm-hmm. Of course, stories are always an embellishment mm-hmm. of the real world, but nevertheless, people report stories of their own experiences involving telepathy and precognition and things like that. Mm-hmm. And since I was always inclined towards science and technology, I wondered, could any of that actually be true? So I did not have personal experiences of that type, right. But my curiosity was piqued, and that's what drew me in.
So you've always been a curious person then?
Yes, one of my friends joked that I must have been born with an extra set of Y chromosomes. Because I was always asking why.
I get that. So who are some of your favorite sci-fi authors?
Well, I read probably everything that Asimov wrote. Mm-hmm. Heinlein, Frank Herbert, Stanislav Lem, mm-hmm. all of the classics. And even today, reading a newer generation mm-hmm. of authors. I can't rattle them off as easily as the older ones because they stuck in my head better.
Right.
But typically what I do when I'm falling asleep, I will play an audiobook of science fiction novels or short stories. And so I sort of drift off to sleep listening to some person speaking a story.
Right. That's a good way for it to get into your psyche, right?
Yeah.
For the benefit of those who are listening who aren't familiar with the Institute of Noetic Sciences, tell the audience what the Institute is all about.
Our institute was founded in 1973 by Edgar Mitchell, who was the Apollo 14 astronaut who was the sixth man on the moon. And in the way back from the moon to the Earth, Edgar had a mystical experience mm-hmm. where he felt, as most mystics will say, he felt one with the universe. Mm-hmm. And not in an abstract way, but in a palpable first-hand experience way.
Right.
And so he was so intrigued by that when he got back to the Earth, he decided to form an institute that would use the tools and techniques of science that got him to the moon, but be applied not to outer space, but to inner space. Mm-hmm. So that's what we've been doing now for almost 50 years. Some of our work involves parapsychological effects, but we're also interested in the general notion of interconnectedness as a general concept or as a working hypothesis, mm-hmm. which among other things suggests that everything is interconnected. Mm-hmm. So it's somewhere between philosophy of idealism or dual aspect monism, or just straightforward esoteric mysticism.
Right.
On the other hand, we're all trained as scientists, and we all come from traditional backgrounds in other disciplines. So we do use the tools and techniques of science, as in any other area of science, but we apply it to study these kinds of topics and phenomena.
I personally had the pleasure of speaking to people like Charles Tart in the past. Russell Targ, Ed Mitchell is a person I interviewed back when he wrote Way of the Explorer many mm-hmm. years ago. like all of these guys and many others, you've taken some criticism for some of your published reports. And mind if I ask you what it is that keeps you going in this field? It takes some endurance, I imagine.
Well, if you look at journals in virtually any discipline, you will find people screaming at each other all
True.
the time. So it's par for the course when you're doing science on the edge of any aspect of the unknown, which is most of everything, that you will find people who disagree with what your ideas are, or your data, or your analysis, or something. It's just the way things are. So it's a little bit different in highly controversial fields because there are more people who are very confident that you're wrong. But I take a certain degree of comfort in the history of science, which shows again and again that people who made massive breakthroughs always encountered a severe amount of criticism. So you look at that and you say, well, if it's too hot, get out of there. And I always viewed it as anything that's actually worth doing that evokes a huge emotional response by somebody else is actually a signal that you're in the right direction. So that's how I view it.
I love it. So you like a challenge, in other words.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a certain degree of rebelliousness in there too.
I get that.
So when I was for example, I was in high school, and in a mathematics class, we were going through things that were considered to be impossible in mathematics, one of which was a trisection of the angle, only using a compass and a straight edge. And so we went through various descriptions of why that is impossible. Well, I didn't like the idea that something was impossible. So I worked on it for a while, and it came up with a method that actually you can do a trisection of an angle. It is not an exact solution. It was a solution that involved an asymptotic approach, where you start with a rather crude trisection, which is not exact, but then you can refine it, and you refine it, and you keep refining it using a series of steps. And you can get down to the point where you're so close that you're closer than the ink on a pen. And actually, you can show that if you continue doing that, just as you would in calculus, essentially, that you can get down to a point where there's no difference, or at least an infinitesimally small difference between the actual trisection and what you provided. So I submitted that. Of course, I didn't know at that point about the whole mathematics of infinitesimals. But nevertheless, I submitted it, and I won the grand prize in the Western Massachusetts Science Fair. So this was an example of not exactly solving what is a impossible problem in mathematics, but developing something that was so close that for practical purposes, it was in fact a trisection.
Well, a lot of what you said went over my head because my mathematics skills are, I'm a musician. I can count to 4, sometimes 7 if we're playing in an odd time.
Music theory is all about mathematics.
Yes, but not calculus. We could do fractions. We can handle that. But I'm impressed, and what I just heard reminded me a good deal of something that Michio Kaku was trying to explain with regards to there being 11 dimensions from a proof standpoint, mathematical proof standpoint. And he said that one of those dimensions was actually closer to me than the clothing is to my skin. Is that the same principle? Are we talking about the same type of thing there with the ink to the pen? No? Okay.
That's different. He's talking about dimensions that are rolled up, so to speak. They're very close to us in the sense that, of course, this is all completely abstract mathematics.
Right.
It is the prevailing idea about how particle physics works. It's this so-called standard model.
Right.
But we don't have any way of testing that. It just turns out that the mathematics allow you to make predictions, and we measure things, and the predictions are pretty close. So maybe there is an 11-dimensional reality, maybe not. Until we can figure out a way of testing if that is in fact the case, it remains at this point a mathematical model.
Well, it always captures my imagination. And, again, I'm a musician or a simple recording engineer who looks at these hieroglyphics that you physicists write on these extensively large blackboards and say, see, here's the proof. For me, it's like, trying to read hieroglyphs. But
So in mathematics, there is the concept of proof.
Mm-hmm.
You can prove something mathematically, but in science is not about proof,
Mm-hmm.
right? Science is about evidence
Mm-hmm.
and whether or not you believe the evidence and have confidence in it. So oftentimes people will say, well, you've proved that telepathy exists.
Mm-hmm.
No, we haven't. We provide better and better evidence
Mm-hmm.
from many different angles, suggesting that it looks like it really does. It's a real thing,
Mm-hmm.
as best as we can tell, but we can't prove it in a sense. You can only prove something in your own experience or in mathematics or in alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
There's proof.
Well, let's talk about the things that can be proven through evidence. Charlie Tart and I talked about this decades ago, and there seems to be this resistance, what he was taking umbrage with, in the scientific community to seriously look at this evidence. Why do you think it is? What's with the resistance? Do you have any clues there?
Oh, yeah. So part of it is that the resistance largely comes out of the academic world, and the academic world is an ideological world in a literal sense. It's all about ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So people make their careers on certain ideas, and then it becomes established in some way, and they become recognized for that.
Mm-hmm.
And if somebody challenges the ideas, mm-hmm. it is as though you are physically attacking them because they identify with their ideas.
Right.
So it's very difficult to get new ideas to penetrate the academic world because you get a lot of pushback. Uh-huh. So some of it is that.
That's a psychological problem. That's not a scientific problem, because science is about saying, hey, we have this one set of evidence which led us to this conclusion, and now we've got a different set of evidence that brings that conclusion to question.
Yeah, and that is the scientific process, and that's why textbooks are revised regularly.
Right.
That still, scientists and academics are human.
Sure.
And so you attack somebody's ideas, it feels like you are being attacked, and people will defend it a lot. Mm-hmm. And this is why Max Planck, among others, said that science progresses by funerals, because the older guard will hold on to their ideas and defend it and prevent new ideas from coming along. So that's one of the issues. Another issue is that a lot of people view that if psychic phenomena were real, it's actually quite frightening, because suddenly secrets, which you may not want to reveal, or secrets you have locked in a safe somewhere, they're no longer secret. And that's frightening. Another thing is that if you look at psychic healing, the flip side immediately becomes apparent, and that somebody at a distance can be thinking bad thoughts about you and make you ill.
Right.
Well, that's frightening too, especially since you can't detect who that may be. So it like raises all of these fears of the many supernatural and horror films that we see,
right,
where things are coming at you and you don't know what they are and you can't stop it. And it's like every nightmare that you can think of. And those fears are, in some people, they will admit that they're frightened of it. Occasionally, I will admit that. Like I think about the consequences of these kinds of phenomena, and also pay attention to the many emails I get from people who claim that they have thoughts being inserted into their head, and they have illnesses they can't account for, and all of these things that would normally be diagnosed as being delusional or schizophrenic. Since we don't have a recognized way of knowing how to handle the possibility that those are actually psychic attacks, which is how people describe them. And it's simply frightening to say, well, besides the fact that we don't have medical treatments for all sorts of things, that one really pushes hard. And so I have great sympathy for people who are disturbed by these experiences, whether they feel they're being attacked or not, because based on our research, we know that psychic experiences are real, in which case it's at least conceivable that some people can be very sensitive to it and be disturbed by them.
Well, we're in the realm of psychology here, and being I'm talking to a psychologist, I suppose we can stay in that realm for a little bit before we get into the realm of quantum theory and all of that stuff. As a trained psychologist, for those who know nothing about it, what is depth psychology and integral studies? What's that about? How does that differ from other branches of psychology?
So there's clinical psychology, which is like psychotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
There's experimental psychology, which studies the way the mind works,
Mm-hmm.
which includes perception and memory and cognition and all of those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
Integral psychology is somewhat of a euphemism for what is also called transpersonal psychology,
Mm-hmm.
which is about the intersubjective reality. So when we're talking to each other, something is happening in our conversation where we're following each other.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not just me talking to myself or you talking to yourself,
Mm-hmm.
but some kind of shared mental space.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's part of it, but it seems to extend beyond that too. So transpersonal psychology, otherwise called integral psychology, is dealing with this larger subjective space that is not just what's happening in my mind or how do I perceive,
Mm-hmm.
but how do we, or a group, or even a collective,
Mm-hmm.
how does that work in mental space too?
You're talking about the relationship of the subject-object split and filling that space in some way.
It's the space between, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So from a psychological point of view, do you see any benefit from studying psi? And if so, what are they in general?
So in general, I would say that the value of studying psi is because it tells us something about who and what we are
Mm-hmm.
and our place in the physical world. So who and what we are is important, obviously, because we would like to know more about what we're capable of.
Mm-hmm.
And there's certainly stories throughout history of the mystics and others who had experiences which they felt revealed the true nature of reality. So very famous people, perhaps like Buddha or
Mm-hmm.
Jesus, had certain ideas.
Mm-hmm.
That has become incorporated into dogma, into religion.
Mm-hmm.
But the source of it was raw experience. And so many people at some point in their life start wondering about why am I here? Why is anything here? Who am I? Who are we? Is there any purpose to reality? All of those kinds of questions, the big questions.
Meaning of my life.
What's the meaning of anything?
Mm-hmm.
So religions provide an answer. People who have mystical experiences have their own answers. People with near-death experiences get answers that are satisfying. The rest of us, who may not be particularly religious or who question the dogma of religion or who haven't had strong personal experiences of mystical or near-death or whatever, we have the same questions as anybody else. What is there meaning to anything?
Right.
Well, to answer that question, we want to know from a conventional perspective, how does my mind work? Is the mind and the brain identical to each other? Or can my mind do things that we don't think the brain is able to do? Are the stories that we hear from mystics correct? Are the stories we read about people with special powers, is that true?
Mm-hmm.
That's where a lot of this comes into play, that the study of psi is actually the study of consciousness.
It is.
It's about the role of consciousness in the physical world and what it can do. So it's easy to become deflected in saying, well, you're studying telepathy. That's intrinsically interesting.
Mm-hmm.
There could be a connection between minds, but it has more to do with the nature of consciousness itself.
It also speaks to the mystery of free will and predeterminism.
It does, especially when you are studying things like precognition.
Mm-hmm.
So precognition, the underlying question underneath it is, first of all, can people predict future events which are not inferable or not predictable? And the answer appears to be yes. But what does that say about the nature of the future? Is it fated? It must occur, or are we perceiving some probable future event? And so there have been a few experiments looking at that. I've run some of them, and as far as we can tell from an experimental point of view, we are predicting the probable future, not one that is fated to occur. And of course, that has very strong implications in terms of free will, because if the future was fated, you don't have free will. You may feel like you do, but you don't.
Right.
Whereas if the future is only probabilistic, then yes, you do have free will.
It also walks into the concepts that are presented by dogma in religions that, there's a deservedness that seems to be doled out boons and banes by a deity But psi seems to me to be revealing that there's an interlinking principle and connectedness to all things, as you were just saying, in this physical world. And that was not only a mystical concept, because Carl Jung also talked about it, and he took a lot of flack for his theory on synchronicity. Is depth psychology an attempt to help people understand this principle and expand the awareness of that phenomenon on any level? Or does psychology need to be separate and scientific?
Well, there are some who view psychology, especially cognitive psychology and neuroscience, as being strictly scientific. It's looking at the outer manifestation or the external aspects of behavior. So the classic case was B.F. Skinner, who almost single-handedly, although with a few others, caused psychology for about 50 years to deny internal experience, to deny even the existence of consciousness. And there are still philosophers today who deny that we have conscious awareness. They see us as machines made out of meat, essentially. We're just automatons, apparently, or zombies, which have the appearance of being independent entities, but not really. So depth psychology is like the flip side of that, in which it is about the search for meaning, the search for what is behind the illusion. And this is why a lot of it has to do with Jung's work and others who it's all about the search for meaning underneath. So, and also about consciousness and awareness. So in psychology, just as in many other disciplines, it is split into many different pieces. So there's social psychology, there's child psychology, there's, you name it, all along the way, because the nature of mind and consciousness is a massive topic.
It is.
So one of the reasons why I like working in this field is because in order to do your job well, you need to know everything. And of course, that's impossible. So you work with colleagues and you have to be multidimensional or multidisciplinary in order to be able to make any headway in this domain. And so it's not unusual, as you see in physics, sometimes there'll be an article that has 350 authors because they're massive projects. Well, it's generally not that big in psychology in general, but sometimes, yeah, you'll find a lot of people collaborating because no one person has enough information or knowledge.
Do you think that this principle of synchronicity has anything to do with what you're presenting in Real Magic?
Well, it probably. One way of thinking about synchronicity, which of course is the notion of a meaningful coincidence, is that any kind of psi experiment is an exercise in creating a synchronicity. That's essentially what we're doing. So it's a little bit different than saying it's just a coincidence that happens to be meaningful, even though that is literally what we see in the laboratory. We design something, it happens. Usually we don't know exactly how it happened. Like we can assign that it should happen, and sure enough, we see something interesting. And what it says is we don't know the underlying mechanism yet. And with the aspiration that is where we're heading, we want to be able to figure out if there is something that actually caused. Is there a sequence of causal steps that made something happen? That's what we mean by mechanism. It might be that there is no classical mechanism when it comes to consciousness, especially if it turns out that something like idealism or dual aspect monism is a better model of reality than strict materialism. Then the notion of mechanism might need to change. You might need to, especially if we're thinking about, if we're all truly interconnected, we're in some kind of holistic reality. How can you think about causation in that kind of a fully interconnected world? Because in a fully interconnected, holistic environment, you do anything in any way at all, and it affects everything. Well, that becomes difficult then to piece apart what caused what. The answer is everything causes everything all the time. And this has also been a notion that has been discussed in science. Most scientists, I think, would agree that everything is interconnected, except for purposes of not knowing yet how to study everything all at once, we carve up the world in little pieces. Part of the etymology of the word science is to cut. So we're cutting apart the universe in lots and lots of little pieces so we can concentrate on them when we find interesting things. Putting it all back together again, that's something we don't know how to do yet.
So let's use models for a minute. I spoke to Ed Mitchell a long time ago, and he was big on the dyadic model and using the quantum hologram as a model. Mm-hmm. Are you still using that as a model personally?
Not so much.
Not so much.
A new edition of The Way of the Explorer is coming out, and I was asked to write an afterword, which brought the book, which was originally written, I think, in the 70s or 80s. It's gone through a number of reissues. Mm-hmm. And so the afterword in this was to bring it up to date. Mm-hmm. From when Ed originally wrote it, and then he did a revision, and now, where are we now? Mm-hmm. So what I said in there is that the nature of the evidence is much, much better. Being much, much better doesn't mean that we're actually much closer to understanding what's going on. Mm-hmm. See, that it's like we're on a race that's 1,000 miles long, and we've taken a few steps, and now we're 20 or 30 years after Edgar wrote the book, and we're 40 steps, 50 steps, but we still have 1,000 miles to go. Amen. Before we actually learn anything. So we're making progress, but there's a long road ahead.
Are we asking better questions these days?
That is part of the advancement, is making better assessment. So one of the changes I think that has happened over time is that we're not studying telepathy per se. We're not studying precognition. We're not studying any of the various kinds of psychic phenomena because of a recognition that they're almost certainly all the same thing. There's some underlying thing that connects all of these phenomena which manifest in different ways, but that doesn't mean that they're different. So it's easy to be deflected by the idea that, oh, you're focusing on telepathy. Well, we're focusing on a phenomenon that at the moment can be described in that terms. That's the way it's experienced, but it's something else is going on. So it's taken a while to get to that point where this is now a prevailing idea. The second thing I think, which is somewhat new, is that many people over the years have been looking for some kind of force or carrier for these kinds of effects. And we never find anything that looks like that.
Right.
That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Maybe we're looking in the wrong place. But instead of force, most people are now talking in terms of information. So information is patterned energy, patterned matter. So the pattern is the thing that makes the difference, not a carrier. It's not electromagnetic signals.
Right.
It's something else more fundamental. So again, it's taken a while to get there. And I expected these kinds of advancements will continue. Some of it is following along what is found in science in general. So for example, from quantum mechanics, you can push down a level into quantum field theory and then push down even deeper into quantum information science. So even in that realm, it looks like information is more fundamental than anything having to do with particles and forces and all this stuff that a lot of physics is still focused on.
And we're also talking about information in this particular dimension. We have to take into account the information that seems to be popping in and out of this dimension, the things that the folks at CERN are seeing with regards to photons being both particle and wave, and the Higgs boson, just popping in and out.
Yeah, and it obviously would not appeal to everyone because you're always working on the edge of the unknown. So you have to become very comfortable with ambiguity. We don't have answers yet.
Right.
For some people, that's very disturbing. Like they won't accept something unless they have an answer. Sorry. Some things are just more complex than we understand.
Well, we like to land places, It's psychologically satisfying to be able to say, I know what I know, and I don't even need to know how I know it. I'm here I am. So from your perspective,
it's comforting. Yeah,
it is. It is for me, little self-disclosure there. I like to know what I'm talking about or thinking about or where I am and who I am, but it doesn't always work like that. And if you study consciousness or explore consciousness enough, you might find that you don't know quite as much as you think you know about yourself.
No, it's like any like any topic. The more you study it, the more you realize what you don't know.
That keeps the mystery alive, though, doesn't it? It's
It
nice.
does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, what's the most significant thing that we have learned in the past 25 years regarding this connection between the quantum and the physical world, consciousness, and how we affect reality?
That has many, many different aspects to that same question. So is it quantum? Maybe, maybe not. Uh, the quantum metaphors are interesting because it seems as though, just as in quantum mechanics, there are complementarities where a photon could be a particle or a wave.
Right.
It seems to be both at the same time. The particle is a little bit like the classical everyday world that we live in. We have objects, particles.
Right.
The wave part is a little bit like the evidence that our minds are not just inside our heads, that we are wave-like. We don't exist in space-time in the same way that a particle does. We extend. So the metaphor is there. Whether the mechanics of quantum mechanics is a way of describing what is going on, the way I put it is that the reason why quantum mechanics is sometimes considered weird is because of two things. One is its non-local nature, which means that there are aspects that extend through space and time, or worse, are not in space and time, they're outside of it in some way. And the second is that the observer effect in quantum mechanics, that what you know about a quantum particle changes its behavior. Well, so those are both pretty strange because we don't see that all the time in the everyday world. But those are the same two strange aspects of psychic phenomena. They don't appear to be locked in space and time in the usual way. And something about our observation or awareness changes aspects of the physical world. So the question can be asked then, is it a coincidence that the edge of physics has run into the same two strange things that we see in our experience? I would say it's not a coincidence. I would say we're on a converging path. We may be far away, still 1,000 miles away, in order to actually converge. But the paths that we're moving in, I think, will end up in the same place. So the more we know about the physical world, the more we are ultimately going to learn more about consciousness itself and vice versa.
The question of how consciousness affects physical systems, the physical world, it's a phenomenon. Obviously, that needs to be explored if we're to continue to evolve into what it is we're becoming. And you and others are obviously seeing an effect through your research and what the experiments you run. I had a nice conversation with Roger Nelson about the Global Consciousness Project.
Yep.
I wonder what goes through your mind about the nature of consciousness and its effects on physical systems. Why are we so slow to make progress in this understanding? Do you think it's mostly a psychological problem, fear, resistance? I understand the academic politics and, holding on to one's belief structure and defending it to the hilt. But the average person, the average explorer, the one who walks around and says, I'm curious. I want to know. I want to try to understand. They're the ones who are trying to find the right path to this connection of understanding how to control consciousness, use consciousness, explore consciousness, and to understand how it's affecting their lives. They suspect it on some level. And I think in your book, you're presenting that as a path to go down. Why don't you talk about real magic as it relates to consciousness and how consciousness affects physical systems?
So the book Real Magic is part of the 4-book series. It'll probably turn into another one as well. So the first book was called The Conscious Universe, and it was laying out how we know using scientific methods that some psychic phenomena are real. The second book was called Entangled Minds, which is answering a question that was often asked by people saying, well, how does any of this stuff work? Which is ultimately a question about physics.
Right.
So that book was all about the underlying physics, which seems to point to this idea that maybe it has something to do with quantum mechanics. We're not sure, but there's a lot of overlap. The third book arose out of questions that I got from that one, which is, well, how do we begin to understand this? Because from a scientific perspective, many scientists, maybe all, are trained in materialism. Materialism makes it really difficult to understand how any of this stuff can be real. And that fact, that is the primary reason for skepticism in science today, that people can't imagine how to understand this because they're so inculcated with the notion that materialism is the way to understand reality that it's just very difficult to get beyond the idea that we are machines made of meat. That's where that idea comes from. So I decided to say to look at other traditions, other worldviews, where these effects are completely accepted. And so we're talking about the esoteric worldviews. So I decided first to look at the Eastern esoteric worldview, which is encapsulated more or less into yoga, and yoga plus or minus a couple of other traditions, but mostly from the East. So my third book was Supernormal, which was about the yogic cities, the special powers that arise as a result of meditation. And so I was showing a parallel between what we know from laboratory experiments about the cities, we call them psychic, and what the yogis knew about this thousands of years ago. And there's a very strong overlap. And then people were asking at the end of that book, well, what about the Western esoteric traditions? So I started looking into that. And of course, you immediately bump up into the notion of magic. So they all come out of the same original source. The cities and magical practices are identical.
Right.
The means of going about them are described in different terms, but are actually very, very similar to each other. They involve meditation and ritual and certain psychedelics and so on. They're all basically saying you need to get into, or you need to step out of your everyday conscious awareness of the world and go into states that a yogi would say is samadhi and a magician would say is gnosis. They're the same thing. And you see these same ideas echoing throughout history, all the way back as far as history goes, even to today. So real magic is then saying, well, the notion of magic as real, meaning divination, is a thing. Well, we know that's real, but we call it in the laboratory somewhere between clairvoyance and precognition or remote viewing. It's all about divining something that is different in space or distant in space or distant in time. That's a magical practice. That's what we see in the laboratory. So I made the parallel there. Second category is force of will. So it's the idea within magical practice in which you can see in thousands of grimoires out there that have magical spells.
Right.
How do I impress my intentions onto the world? And the magical spell then is seen in two different ways. One is I want to have a love connection. Well, that's manipulating the world. It's manipulating somebody else's feelings about you, which, by the way, is black magic because it's overriding somebody else's free will,
right?
Which is a no-no.
Not unless you want to pay the price, of course.
Yeah, unless you pay the price. So, yeah, the picture of Dorian Gray.
Right.
So the other aspect of force of will magic is what we can call it destiny shaping or destiny engineering. You want to achieve certain things in life, which in order to do that may require a huge amount of things to go in your favor. And so the whole gigantic book genre of affirmations, positive thinking is all around that. That is coming straight out of the magical traditions. And then the third category of magic, traditional magic, is theurgy, which is about communicating with and dealing with spirits or disembodied something or others.
Right.
So in that category, there's the least amount of scientific evidence. The closest that we have to something like that is what mediumship studies show. The mediums can get real information about people who are departed. We still don't know that there are any objective evidence for the departed, ghosts and so on. There's a lot of experiences associated with it, but we don't know yet what that is. So Real Magic, the book, is about how does this Western esoteric tradition permeate, which it does, Western culture. It's everywhere. The easiest way to see that is by looking at our entertainment, our TV shows and our movies. hundreds and hundreds of examples where traditional Western magical schemes and themes are used as plot points. So that's part of it. The other part then is saying, well, if magic is real, then what do I do with it? Can I make it? Can I use it in some way?
Right.
So I have a chapter on that. I talk about it a little bit. And so the next book I'm thinking of writing would be on practical magic. Mm-hmm. The reason why I've hesitated to do that, I have ideas, but I haven't written anything yet, is because there's already a gazillion books out there on practical magic.
None of which are science.
Yeah, I mean, well, there are no science books on practical magic
That's
yet.
what I'm saying, yeah.
Yes, that is the new part that I can bring to it. Just as there are a million books on magic, there haven't been many books saying, well, look, science has actually tested some of these concepts and it turns out that they're true. That's new. So I don't want to write a book where you can find a million different versions of it.
Right.
I'm only interested in something that is going to contribute something that is new. So I'm still working at how do I provide a book on practical magic that can be backed up with something saying, well, we know that this works in a controlled environment. Whether it will work for you in your environment, we can't say very much, but we can at least say that in principle, that this particular technique will do something. I talk about that a little bit in my book, Real Magic, but I don't really focus on it.
I think you can actually go there. The Western model of consciousness has more to do with self-actualization. We use our consciousness to improve our lives. I salute your idea. I hope that you'll go down that path because I think you're the guy to do that and try to put that into a satisfying 21st century model that actually makes sense and gets out of the realm of superstition because we are, in fact, creating reality. On some level, we just don't know how, like when these synchronicities show up. I don't want to tell you what book to write, but I love your idea. Where I'm going.
Well, I think the closest modern way of thinking about magic would be chaos magic. So the chaos magic idea was strong, called chaos magic because it was based on chaos mathematics in the 70s. But a lot of it would be considered a kind of scientific approach. It was saying that magic works because whatever consciousness is, it seems to have the capacity for changing probabilities of events. And the other thing was that Carroll, who wrote all these chaos magic books, was pushing just as Aleister Crowley did. Keep a journal and records of what you're doing. Keep track of what works for you. Well, that's what scientists do. That's why we have a lab journal. We keep notes about what works and what doesn't work. So ancient magical ideas have slowly been infiltrating into modern methods, modern epistemological approaches. And there eventually I'll come up with a way of entering this topic. This is what's blocked me so far. How do I get into the topic in a way that is scientifically justifiable, but is also talking about what you actually do in magic? So if somebody didn't care about any of the underlying ideas, and there's plenty of books and affirmations, all of which say the same thing again and again in a million different ways. So, I mean, you don't need the theory in a sense. You do this, and this, and then that's the outcome. Well, as a scientist, I'm as equally interested in, well, why did that work? And even if we don't know exactly how to explain why would this practice help the outcome? Those kinds of things.
Great questions.
Yeah.
I mean, they're questions that need to be answered, I think.
Yeah. And that's why I haven't written it yet, because I don't have answers that I can justify at this point.
Well, you have a lot of clues to work off of. You're a physicist, you're a psychologist, you understand the nature of quantum mysteries, you understand the nature of consciousness mysteries. I love to ask this question of all my guests, so I'm going to have to ask this one of you. How do you define consciousness?
Yeah, so it's about awareness. It's about subjective experience and awareness. So it includes experience and self-awareness. That's it.
So
it's It's much bigger than that because we also have aspects of our awareness that we're not aware of, right? The unconscious, subconscious, preconscious. There's lots of aspects of what's going on in our minds that we don't have conscious access to. And so it's a gigantic issue because the moment that you're talking about awareness that you don't have awareness of, it's a little bit like intuition. You know something, but you don't know how you know it. So there are many of these kinds of complexities involved here, but in its simplest sense, consciousness is awareness of self and sensory input and the rest of the world.
Do you not see consciousness as a sea in which we swim as well?
Well, now we're diving into philosophy.
Yes, we are.
Yes. So I don't have the mind of a philosopher.
Okay.
Of a mind of a philosopher is somebody who swims very easily in an abstract space because it's about ideas and about getting the words right and all that. And my mind doesn't go there. I get a headache after a while if I read too much. In fact, I'm reading this book. In fact, I have to do a review of this book. So this book is Dual Aspect Monism and the Deep Structure of Meaning. Okay. This is a brand new book, just came out. I'm writing a review of it, and it's forcing me to pay attention. So it's not a gigantic book. It's only, what is it, like 100 page? No, it's like 200 pages. I can read 10 pages at a time. And then if I have ever had any trouble sleeping, I don't have trouble sleeping then. It's very taxing for me to spending most of my life doing science and engineering and practical mathematics and stuff.
Right.
I just find it difficult to grasp this. But the questions that you're asking is really all about philosophy. It's like, what do we think reality consists of? And so I talk in Real Magic quite a bit about idealism, because from that point of view, there's really only one fundamental thing in the universe. It's consciousness. That's it. That's all there is. Everything else emerges out of consciousness. This is the essence of all of the esoteric traditions, Eastern and Western.
Right.
Well, that makes it very easy to understand why things like magic and psychic phenomena and mysticism, why they work, because it's all having to do with mind in a large sense, or consciousness. But we don't know yet how to make what we know about the physical world to be compatible with this notion that everything starts with something like gigantic mind or big C consciousness, universal consciousness. Right. We don't know how that emergence process works, at least not from a scientific perspective. You can talk to people from esoteric traditions, of which there are many, meditative traditions who have all sorts of interesting models that say what happened. But from my perspective, they're stories.
They are. And I think that they have a unique purpose in the elevation of consciousness. Joseph Campbell did a lot of research on the ubiquitous nature of the same types of stories amidst cultures, cross-cultural.
Right.
Speaking about, not only being a part of that particular culture and the teaching stories, but also about the interconnectedness of things, what it means to be truly authentically human, and perhaps even more than human. And I wonder sometimes if we're not at a bifurcation point in our evolution, and that bifurcation point has a lot to do with the decisions about how we use consciousness. So consciousness, yes, is awareness, and it's also something greater because we know it goes outside of time. It is not time dependent. And I often wonder if the problem isn't found in this concept of time. You probably know more about this because you're a physicist. We know that the arrow of time is something we humans are, been noticing since the birth of self-reflective awareness. Okay, we know we're born, we wonder what it's all about, and we know that we die, and we wonder what that's all about. And we have all kinds of stories around that. So it's inherent in us, our understanding of birth, life, and death. Entropy is also something that we take for granted, having to do with the arrow of time. I like the old proverb. It's an Arabic proverb, I want to say. Man fears time, but time fears the pyramids.
No, I haven't heard that before, but I get it.
You get it, right?
Yeah.
But the interesting thing to me is that consciousness is not bound by time at all. We can move in time all we like. So I'm wondering, as a physicist, as a psychologist, as an experimenter, do you think that perhaps in expanding and broadening our understanding of consciousness and time as being in relationship to one another, and perhaps shifting that paradigm, then maybe we might get closer to an answer as to the mechanisms behind the results that we see in any psi experiments? The whole concept of information, the whole concept of experience is found in time. No time, no experience. No information can't travel through. What are your thoughts on time?
Well, because we have pretty good evidence about precognition, that's yet another indication that there's something funny about time. This is now a topic, and has been for a long time, a topic of discussion among physicists. And things like retrocausation and the nature of time. Many scientists today, at least those who think about these things, are coming around to the idea that time is a mental construct, in essence. It's a way that we understand, a way that we use to describe how things unfold in something, that there things change. Well, the change we then see as time, as a separate dimension or something, but it may not be a fundamental. And of course, if time is not a fundamental, then our whole notion of space-time suddenly is no longer fundamental either.
Right.
And so one of the interesting leading edge ideas within physics is that before space and time, there is entanglement. And so the construction of space, or the emergence of space itself, comes out of entangled particles, perhaps, or maybe they're not even particles at that point, but the notion of entanglement.
Right.
So in sufficiently holistic environments, you may have the emergence of what we would perceive as both space and time, both of them. But once again, I'm not really a physicist. I work in physics, but I work in lots of things. So like I work in mathematics. That doesn't make me a mathematician per se. I use statistics all the time, and I'm not exactly a statistician either.
Got it.
So if anything, I'm a journeyman in many different areas, because I've, in a sense, been forced to, in order to be able to do the kind of work that I do. But sometimes, like a physicist, a quote real physicist, would have a degree in physics.
Right.
Well, I don't, but I publish articles in physics journals. So does that make me a physicist? I don't know.
I'm sorry. I thought you had master's.
My undergraduate and master's are electrical engineering.
Electrical engineering. Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it is physics, but it's different. It's all about practical uses.
You know more about physics than I do. I can count to 4.
Well, no, you're an audio engineer, so you're doing the same kind of engineering that I used to do.
That, there's truth in that, and my algebra has gotten me that far in practical application with regards to the propagation of sound waves and my understanding of, it comes in handy, but I never would put myself in the category that you have with the talents that you possess. In your book, Real Magic, in Chapter 6, you discuss Merlin-class magicians. What is a Merlin-class magician?
Those are the people who can do things, or at least we have stories that they're able to do things that we have never been able to test in the laboratory. So we're talking about people like St. Joseph, who could levitate, and of which there are hundreds, if not thousands, of eyewitness reports from everyday people all the way up to kings and princes and scientists of the day who said, he would levitate regularly, all the time. I mean, the problem was that he couldn't stand still. He kept flying all the time, even in front of the Inquisition, which is probably not such a great idea. So I would love to have somebody who could levitate even a millimeter for a microsecond, but we don't see that. So it's left in the form at this point of a historical story, which suggests that it might be true, but maybe it's only 1 in a billion people who can do it. And so the 8 people out there in the world who can do this, they don't want to go into the laboratory.
Is that the resistance there? That they don't want to be tested? Because there are plenty of folks who make all sorts of claims, about
Right.
their ability to do this, that, and the other. And
Well, for a major macroscopic effect like levitation, there are stories.
mm-hmm.
You look into the stories today, what they're doing is jumping.
Mm-hmm.
They're not levitating at all.
Right.
And so for someone like St. Joseph was apparently able to levitate up 30, 40 meters and then just float there for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we don't see that.
No.
So we don't exactly know what to do with it then. So we jump ahead a couple of centuries to D.D. Home, a physical medium, who was also able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And again, thousands of people have investigated him and seen this happen, including scientists who were very skeptical and didn't know what to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
Again, maybe 1 in a billion people who can do such things, maybe more. But if somebody had that level of talent, they would surely recognize, especially in today's world, that if you came out in public and demonstrated that,
Mm-hmm.
you would either be killed immediately
Mm-hmm.
because people would fear you,
Mm-hmm.
or you would be put in some kind of a black program somewhere and never be heard from again because
Mm-hmm.
people would want to use you in some way.
Right.
But basically, there's no upside to that at all. And so anybody who has those kinds of skills, yeah, there's very good reasons for not coming into the laboratory or demonstrating what they can do.
And we're back to fear again, aren't we?
Yeah,
As being one of those reasons that perhaps we're not making quite the leaps that we could be making in this bifurcation point.
That's true.
You're also the founder of Cognogenics. What is Cognogenics?
Cognogenics is a neuroengineering company. And so it's a biotech company.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're doing is using the latest version of genetic editing tools called CRISPR,
Mm-hmm.
which got the Nobel Prize for its inventors a few years ago, or last year, I think.
Charpentier and Jennifer Doudna. Yeah.
Yes. And so CRISPR is essentially taking like engineering tools
Mm-hmm.
and being able to revise human genetics.
Mm-hmm.
So our approach to it was that we wanted to create the pill from the movie Limitless.
Mm-hmm.
We want a limitless pill. You take this pill and suddenly you're 1,000 times more effective in terms of cognitive ability.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to do that, you need at this point at least to do, you could either do 40 years of meditation
Mm-hmm.
and be very lucky at having natural skills
Mm-hmm.
to do that, but nobody has time to do that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So how else can we do it? Well, we know enough about neuroanatomy now to know that you can start manipulating the way that the brain works and cause all kinds of interesting things
Mm-hmm.
to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to develop this as a company, that you have to, at the very first level, show that it can do something which will help a lot of people medically.
Mm-hmm.
And so our first product is all about anxiety and depression.
Mm-hmm.
So for people who have chronic anxiety or chronic depression that cannot be helped by existing drugs, and there's a pretty substantial number who fall into that category,
Mm-hmm.
we know enough about why the drugs work, the mechanism of action of drugs like Zoloft, for example. These are so-called SSRI drugs.
Mm-hmm.
We know how they work, and they have pretty bad side effects as a result because you take the drug and it goes throughout your entire body. So we thought, well, could we edit the receptors in certain neurons to change the way that the brain is interacting with serotonin?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's largely responsible for chronic anxiety and depression.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it turns out that we have now done a number of experiments with mice, which is the way you always start these things,
Poor guys.
where we have a way of non-invasively changing the neuronal receptors
Mm-hmm.
for serotonin. And then you can measure to see whether are the mice less anxious, less depressed. And the answer is yes.
Mm-hmm.
So we're now at a second phase where we're using human neurons in vitro.
Mm-hmm.
We would need FDA approval in order to do actual experiments with humans, but we can do it in vitro with human neurons to show that we can edit those neurons in the same way and then provide proof of principle that not only does it actually work in mice, but it would work in principle in humans. Then we go to the FDA and we get approval to do human trials. And so We're not talking about changing DNA.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about RNA.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a temporary fix. It probably would, at this point, we're not sure, but be something like a single treatment that would last maybe for 6 months and would resolve issues of chronic anxiety and depression.
Uh-huh.
So our first entry point is within the mental health space.
Mm-hmm.
And then beyond that, well, can we improve memory?
Mm-hmm.
Can we fix Alzheimer's? Can we fix dementia? Can we help all of those things? The answer is probably yes.
Focus, concentration, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah.
Awareness of subtle vibrational energies, working within the hologram. I mean, there are all kinds of things you can go, you know what? We're going to have you back to talk about your work at Cognogenics. That's impressive. I mean, what I know about CRISPR is based on documentaries that I've seen. But so you're not talking about editing the palindromes. You're coming at this from an mRNA perspective first.
It's not only mRNA, but in that direction. Mm-hmm. It's about the revising or temporarily knocking out mm-hmm. the behavior of certain receptors in the brain, and mm-hmm. you can do that genetically.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at the genetic code, you find the portion of it. Mm-hmm. If you go to the atlases mm-hmm. now that show what genes do, mm-hmm. it's unbelievable how much we know in a very short period of time, from yes. the beginning of the first human genome to mm-hmm. what we know now what happens in tiny little pieces mm-hmm. of the genes. It's amazing. So you can go in and you can figure out and do it completely in silico, mm-hmm. as they say. Mm-hmm. You can say, well, we want to downregulate certain receptors in the brain, 5-HT2A receptors. Mm-hmm. Can we downregulate them so there are not as many of them as there are before? Mm-hmm. Yeah, you take this little piece of genetic code, mm-hmm. you snip it out, mm-hmm. or you silence it. There's mm-hmm. all kinds of ways of doing that.
Right.
And then you get it into the brain, and sure enough, it works. So huge ethical considerations in this, because now we're talking about literally reshaping our whole being in terms of the brain.
Yes.
Even if consciousness is completely separate, mm-hmm. like the brain is a receiver of mm-hmm. consciousness,
right?
We're talking about changing the receiver.
Yep.
And now, it's no longer shortwave. It's something completely different.
And it is a conversation of ethics that I don't think anybody's invited to. I mean, the general public.
Oh, yeah. But in the scientific world, there are many people who are seriously looking at this now.
I sincerely hope they're taking the human spirit into consideration. I mean, I know you are. So that gives me hope.
Yeah, no, we're thinking about this carefully. And that's why the mental health space mm-hmm. for genetics mm-hmm. is almost nobody is going there. It's difficult. We're not doing something that's easy. Mm-hmm. But we've been able to raise funds mm-hmm. For this, and we see a roadmap for how this will make a lot of the drugs that are used for mental health mm-hmm. much, much better with many fewer side effects. We're targeting the mechanism of action in the brain, somewhat in the body, but mostly in the brain, and doing it non-invasively, which mm-hmm. is an important element.
Amen.
So today, if you have Parkinson's, there are genetic treatments that are on the leading edge, mm-hmm. but it requires either a 6-inch needle directly into your head, or it requires in IV, right. so it goes throughout your entire body, or if you prefer, an injection into your cerebral spinal fluid, which will eventually get into the brain. Mm-hmm. We have a completely different method that doesn't require any of that, and it still works.
I like all of your non-invasive approaches, and I can't wait to hear how far you've come with this in our next conversation, because, as I said, you are a voice to be heard when it comes to this conversation. I have to thank you for your serious and scientific inquiry into magic, consciousness, the psyche. I really wish there were more scientists of your ilk. I know Bob Monroe would have appreciated your being out there doing your thing. It's my understanding that there'll be a greater interaction between Monroe Institute and Institute of Noetic Sciences. Is that correct?
Yes.
Right. I look forward to hearing all of what you're up to. Yeah, I think you're a brilliant guy, and I really do appreciate the approach that you take to this. And you have my gratitude and the gratitude of all those who are following what you're doing and reading your books.
Thank you.
I'll look forward to our next conversation then.
Very good.
Thank you very much, Dean Radin.
You're welcome.
Be certain to tune in again to Expanding on Consciousness to become informed on the fascinating field of consciousness studies and its applications. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the guests and the host. They do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Monroe Institute. Expanding on Consciousness is underwritten and produced by the Monroe Institute, copyright 2022, and is broadcast by permission. Reproduction or redistribution without the express written consent of Monroe Institute is prohibited by law. For more information about Expanding on Consciousness, visit our website at monroeinstitute.org or connect with us on the socials. Thank you for listening.